Welcome, folks. You have reached another UERU Town Hall. I'm Steve Dandino, and I am privileged to serve as the Executive Director of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, and also as an Associate Provost at Colorado State University, which has hosted UERU since 2013. We're going to just take a moment to let folks join the Town Hall. We have a good number registered for today's first substantive town hall in the wake of our August 2 through 4 leadership summit. By substantive, I mean focused on leadership and structural and cultural change. And its title is From Upheaval to Action, What Works in Changing Higher Ed, the Case of Brandeis University. And we've stolen that title from President Arthur Levine's new book with Scott Van Pelt, Johns Hopkins University Press, just out a few months ago, From Upheaval to Action, which is the follow-up volume from their 2005 book together called The Great Upheaval, Higher Education's Past, Present, and Uncertain Future. So we certainly want to recommend that town hall participants consider going to the Johns Hopkins University Press website and availing themselves of these two books, which pair wonderfully and which are incredibly relevant to our current situation. Again, welcome. This is the UERU Town Hall, From Upheaval to Action, What Works in Changing Higher Ed, the Case of Brandeis University. And I think what makes this town hall particularly special and important for us as leaders interested in undergraduate education is that we have both President Arthur Levine of Brandeis University, co-author of this book, and many others in his distinguished career as a higher ed expert, but also our distinguished colleague, Jeffrey Shoulson, who serves at Brandeis University as the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Affairs and Dean of Undergraduate Studies. And together, President Levine and Dr. Shoulson will describe not only what's in this important new book, but also ongoing reform efforts at Brandeis, which are aligned in many ways with the ideas and principles articulated in the volume. So I think lots of folks have joined. And as you know, UERU town halls are meant to be informal. We'll ask you to use the chat as you wish for chatting. And also, if you'd like to place questions there, you're welcome to do so. Later, when it comes time for Q&A, we'll be glad to either answer your questions directly. You can unmute and pose them yourself, or we'll read them from the chat if you prefer, whichever is fine with us. I'm seeing lots of folks join. We're grateful for your taking time today. Recall that this town hall, like all of them, are recorded and will be posted at UERU.org straight away as soon as we're able to have it properly captioned and posted. I think we're in great shape. President Levine, Dr. Shoulson, Jeffrey, great to see you. Welcome. Thank you for taking time to describe the book and what's happening at Brandeis. I'll turn things over to you, President Levine. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. And I want to thank everybody who's watching for giving up some of the waning days of summer to spend time with us. So the story is this: in 2025, I did a book with Scott Van Pelt on the future of higher education. And what we hadn't anticipated was we got invited to lots and lots of campuses and to associations and to accreditors and to foundations. And we went to almost 75 of those. And what we found out was how colleges and universities were in fact dealing with the great upheaval. And Scott and I never planned to write another book. We felt we've been privileged to get a broad view of what was going on in higher education, an in-depth look at a lot of different kinds of institutions. So we wrote another book, thus contributing to environmental difficulties and loss of trees. But the thing I should say is that what the book found was that most colleges and universities truly understood the problem that we faced. The real difficulty was they didn't know what to do about it. Let me start with that point and say that some things you already know. And what I'd say is the United States is fast moving from a national analog industrial economy to a global digital knowledge economy. And the last time we had change this profound, this fast, this continuing was the Industrial Revolution. And we can see all the signs around us of the change. We can see it demographically. We can see it in a new kind of knowledge economy. We can see it in digital technology. We can see it in globalization. We can see it now also unanticipatedly in the politics of the nation. And to begin with and explain what the real challenge to us is, during the last transformation, during the Industrial Revolution, higher education shifted from a collection of largely church-related small colleges to universities, great universities, research at places like Johns Hopkins, graduate education, PhDs, new degrees, practical institutions like MIT, land-grant institutions like Cornell, the creation of community colleges, then junior colleges. The landscape was unrecognizable in the years after the Civil War. And for us, what really stands out is Henry Adams, in his book, The Education of Henry Adams. Henry Adams is a historian, he was a journalist. And what he said was he lamented. He was also the great-grandson of a president, the grandson of a president. I have no idea what his father did. He was some kind of slacker. He never became president. But Henry Adams went to Harvard in 1850. And he lamented the fact that he received an 18th century education to prepare him for a world plunging into the 20th century. Harvard didn't intend to provide him a 200-year-old education. The problem was the world changed just so quickly. And that's the challenge facing all of us. How do we prepare students for a world in which things are going to be different than the world in which we grew up, for a world that's going to be different to the world in which their parents grew up? And so what I ought to say as preface is that at Brandeis, what we came to realize was that the liberal arts are most successful. Undergraduate education is most successful when we have one foot in the library, the classroom, the collected wisdom of humanity, and one foot in the street, the real world. But when the world changes really, really quickly, what happens is that we lose our hold on the street, and it needs to be restored. The liberal arts undergraduate education have shifted throughout time. But the one thing that's always been true is that it's always been practical. It's always been created for its time, the needs of its times, and the education students need. What it meant was we needed to catch up this time. So what Brandeis did was we decided as a community, a faculty and administration, a student body, that our job would be to reinvent the liberal arts for the global digital knowledge world. What we concluded was that Brandeis could be an interesting example for this reason. We didn't have to do this. We weren't in danger of closing. We had no major problems facing us other than the ones I've outlined. And we thought by doing this, we could hopefully create a model that the rest of higher education could look at and maybe consider doing. What made it different, and then I'm going to turn to Jeffrey to describe it, is that it moves from a focus on teaching and fixed time and fixed process to a focus on learning, to a focus not on process but outcomes, to a focus not on time but on achievement, what students know and students can do. Jeffrey was instrumental in bringing this program to fruition. And let me turn to him to describe it.
Thanks, Arthur. I'll just add one other element that I think made it possible to do something like this at Brandeis as quickly as we did. And I want to just note how rapidly we were able to push through a lot of these changes. We're still working through some of the details, but it happened really over the course of a year and a half. And that is that we are a sort of unusual combination of a small liberal arts college and a Research One university. And that combination and the smallness of our size meant that we could be a bit more nimble, I suppose, than some institutions have the luxury of being. We were able to work through a lot of these changes in full consultation and in full discussion and collaboration with our faculty. When we presented to the faculty the preliminary plan to reorganize the academic units of the institution, to combine our undergraduate school of liberal arts and sciences, the PhD programming granting departments, as well as our professional schools into a single academic unit that would combine the theoretical and the applied, the practical and the academic. We received faculty approval, close to 90% faculty approval in that restructuring process.
I should add one thing. Jeffrey and I couldn't get 90% of the faculty to agree today was Tuesday.
Yeah.
So we were very, very fortunate.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. And I think it just showed that our faculty were ready for something different as well. They understood why this would be a useful and important development, and we got their support. Now, of course, the reorganization was really only the first step in what needed to happen. And the next step in that was really taking a hard look at our core curriculum, at our Brandeis core, and trying to understand to what extent it was speaking to this sort of new emerging world that Arthur just described, a world where the relationship between a college education and its outcomes, where students were going to be going after they graduated, needed to have a greater focus paid on them. Simply for no other reason than the cost of higher education has gotten so high that families are understandably looking for some assurance that their students are going to graduate with prospects for gainful employment that will return some of the investment that they've made. We've known that there's always been a value in liberal arts education. It's not something that we have ever had any doubts about, but I think it has become, in the broader climate that Arthur described that led us to these changes, harder for us to make some of those arguments. It's been harder to discern. I don't have to go into some of the political attacks that higher education has been facing in the United States. I'm sure all of you know them better than I could ever possibly describe them. So one of the things that we focused on was trying to make much more visible and much more communicable by our students, by our faculty, what kinds of skills the students are already getting in the coursework that they're doing to satisfy the core curriculum, that are the sorts of durable skills, the portable skills, the things that will help them be successful, irrespective of the kind of careers paths they follow, irrespective of the kinds of lives they go on to lead. So some of the changes that we ultimately developed, and again, this was done in collaboration with faculty over the course of several months, looking at our current curriculum, figuring out where the changes needed to be. So a good deal of the changes that we made were changes in really how we describe what we're doing, rather than necessarily the content of what we're doing. We did add some new content areas, in particular focusing on teamwork and collaboration. But again, by adding that as what we now call a core competency, we weren't necessarily adding new courses to what we were offering. We were merely trying to highlight that we had so many courses that already featured group work and class projects and participatory connections amongst students that we wanted to foreground and recognize in the ways that students were doing that work, so that it could be demonstrable to people that they went to talk to when they were having job interviews or when they were talking to people outside of the academy. Yes, I know how to do teamwork and collaboration. I do that all the time in my coursework, and here's how I can demonstrate that. So a lot of our efforts were around making these skills, these competencies that we knew were already there in our curriculum, more explicit, more visible to the students, and ultimately to the world outside of the campus. Go ahead.
Oh, let me add a few elements. So far I've described two parts of the change. Jeffrey talked about the core, and the reality is that students have an opportunity to achieve competencies in those durable skills and to receive certification for doing so. Jeffrey also described the reorganization of our schools. We had the traditional mix of schools. We had an arts and science college. We had graduate schools. We had professional schools. And what we did was we asked that we join them. And the way we do that is we would put liberal arts and applied subjects together. It would give the applied subjects a firmer base. It would give the liberal arts a chance to see the applications. So we created a school of social science and social policy. We created a school of economics and business. We created a school of science and engineering and technology. We created a school of arts, humanities, and culture. But we did one other thing. We created a Center on Applied Liberal Arts. And what that center does is when a student arrives at Brandeis, the student gets two advisors. One's an academic advisor, and the other is a career advisor. And people asked when we started this, oh my God, are we becoming vocational? I think that career advising is really, really important for this reason. I have a friend who graduated summa from Brandeis, and he went to Harvard Law School, and he did really well there. And then he went to work at a New York law firm. I think he hated every day he spent at that firm. If that isn't terrible career advising, I don't know what is. Second, we want to give students experiences in applying the liberal arts. So we all know about internships and internship programs. We want to go beyond that. We want to do simulations. We want to do mini internships. We want to do using teaching methods like case method to teach students. So we're interested in this in terms of an array of different kinds of experiences, as well as an array of different teaching methods. Third, what we want to do is we're creating a second transcript. And that second transcript will record all the competencies that students achieve while they're at Brandeis. The durable competencies they achieve through general education and the career-related competencies they can achieve while they're at Brandeis, maybe through internships, maybe through courses of study, maybe through activities they're involved in. It's intended as a transcript for employers and for grad schools, also suitable for sending to relatives for Christmas. Okay, so that's our program. Jeffrey was right. This is my third college presidency. I've been told I have to keep doing this until I get it right. So that with this one, I've never had an experience like this. I arrived in November. We presented the program we've described to you in January to the faculty. And then we held about 7 million meetings with moderators selected by the faculty for those meetings. At the end of March, we held a vote. So it's 5 months into my presidency. And I had no idea whether the plan would pass. And Jeffrey told you, 88% of our faculty voted in favor. The board voted in favor. They gave us $25 million to implement this new program. And others jumped in. The Educational Testing Service thought the assessments of the competencies was really important, and they offered to help us develop them pro bono. And the Carnegie Corporation, which is responsible for the Carnegie unit, gave us $1 million to create the transcript. The new schools came into existence in July. In the fall, we began planning the center. The new general education curriculum was approved in January. Yeah. And that we didn't do nearly as well. We only got about 70% of the faculty to approve. Even so, this is wonderful. We piloted a lot of this stuff in the spring, and we're implementing the entire curriculum in the fall. We've been very, very lucky. Our applications are up by 40%. We had more applications last year than we ever had at Brandeis. And we've been getting a lot of press for the new program.
Yeah, I'll just add two more things, and then maybe we can welcome some questions, unless there's more that we want to share. So the first is, I want to come back to something that Arthur said earlier, which is that part of what we're trying to achieve here is a recognition that learning doesn't just happen in the classroom, and that students gain enormous experience, very useful experience, not just even in the things like internships and research assistantships, but in their co-curricular activities, in their extracurricular activities. So when it comes to something like the micro-credentials, the durable skill micro-credentials, or even the hard skill micro-credentials, we are structuring them in ways so that the students can earn them through a combination of coursework and other kinds of activities where the particular competency or skill that's being highlighted in the micro-credential is a feature of the experience. So for example, if we're doing a micro-credential in oral and written communication, if you're a writer or an editor for the school newspaper, you're getting some pretty good experience in written communication by virtue of that activity. So our idea is to create a pathway towards a micro-credential that would incorporate some of the coursework, which is writing intensive or features oral communication, add to it some of the intensive experience that a student might have in something like being an editor on a school newspaper or something like that, and then cap it off with an external assessment that would attest to the achievement of a certain level of competency or skill level in that area that's not tied to any one exclusive experience or course, but that is a sort of summative assessment, and that could then appear on the second transcript, and Brandeis would be able to stand behind that as having a good deal of value. There's micro-credentials for all kinds of things all over the country right now. And one of the concerns that I had, and I know a lot of us had when we started talking about micro-credentials, is that they're often worth less than the digital, the electrons that they appear, that are used to represent them on the screen. But if we can somehow provide some degree of not a guarantee, but at least some backing, institutional backing, that we can affirm that the student has actually achieved a degree of competency through these various steps, then we can stand behind that micro-credential, and it will have a greater deal of value for the students when they present them on their CVs, on their LinkedIn pages, that sort of thing. The other thing that we're currently working on, so you've been hearing that this is a kind of staged process. First was the reorganization, then there was the Brandeis core revision. The next step that we're in the final phases of developing and will present to the faculty is a revamping of what is another feature of our core requirements, which is something we call health, wellness, and life skills. And in its current iteration or its current form, it's a series of short 5 to 6 week modules that cover different aspects of adulting, really is the best way to describe it. Ways of becoming an adult in the world and taking responsibility for yourself. Some of which are quite important while you're in college, but certainly many of them will stand you in good stead beyond. We're now preparing a proposal that will replace at least some of those modules with a single unified semester-long experience that students will have that will combine things around navigating health and safety. So every student has to know a little bit about substance use and about intimacy relationships and things like that. It's a federal requirement, and it's something that we take very seriously. We have a module that we are now expanding that's about being a successful college student. And then we're adding to that the first of what will be a series of career modules to help students start to think a little bit about what's next for their lives after they graduate. We don't expect first-year students to have it all figured out, but we want them to start thinking a little bit more metacognitively outside of their particular classes about what this is all going to fit together to mean. And it's an opportunity for meaning making, an opportunity for students to kind of start to self-author, to kind of create their own selves through this process of education that they undertake during their 4 years in college. And so what we hope to have is at the end of this proposal, something that we can then implement and that will be required of all first-year students. It may have counterparts in subsequent years, though we want to take it one step at a time. And it's really about self-reflection. It's really about giving students a chance to think above and beyond and outside of any specific class, any specific experience, to see how it all fits together in this larger project they have of creating their own selves, creating their own lives. And in my mind, that's the most important thing we can give students as they graduate, is that sense of how am I creating this path in my life? I may not know everything that I'm going to be doing right now. I may not have all the answers, but I know how to think about these things in ways that are synthetic, that are integrative, and that draw upon all of the various experiences that I have over the course of my life.
Well, would we like to pivot to questions at this point?
Sure.
Fabulous. Greg Britton at Johns Hopkins University Press doesn't require that I hold up this book and promote it, but I'm doing it anyway. One thing we want everyone to consider is go get this book. You're going to really enjoy reading it. Some of the questions are appearing in the chat. We also have a raised hand. I'll start with the chat, if that's okay, kind of go in order. And I just kind of lost the one I was going to read from our colleague at Tulane. Here it is. Tony Weiss at Tulane. As the director of the Tulane Teaching Center, Tony writes, I am interested in how your Center for Teaching and Learning worked with faculty to help in this transition.
Yeah, that's an important question. We have a wonderful partner in our Center for Teaching and Learning, Adam Beaver, who I work with very regularly. He has been a terrific thought partner in thinking about what we want the learning outcomes to be in many of these core competencies. We built the core competencies based on the National Association of Colleges and Employers competencies. They have 8 core competencies that they have developed over years. And so we use that as the basis for our competencies, but we wanted to be sure that the outcomes, the learning outcomes associated with those competencies that we've implemented are consistent with our overall mission around the value of the liberal arts. And so Adam has been a really helpful partner in developing a lot of this work. He's helping us to develop resources for faculty who are interested in modifying their syllabi or perhaps developing new classes that would fit into the core curriculum. We haven't mentioned one of the big elephants in the room right now, I know for all of us, which is the advent of artificial intelligence and how that is disrupting higher education in a significant way. Adam is partnering with the head of the center that Arthur mentioned, the Center for Careers for the Applied Liberal Arts, to develop an AI boot camp that will be helpful for faculty, staff, and students to start to introduce them to the kind of the crazy and constantly moving world of artificial intelligence and what its features are, what its limitations are, what its ethical dimensions are. So it's critical, I think, to have a strong Center for Teaching and Learning and a staff who in that center who can work very well with your faculty as they work through some of these changes.
That program that you two have put together, the AI Bootcamp, is terribly, terribly exciting. What it means is that as students arrive at Brandeis, one of the first competencies they'll be able to achieve is in artificial intelligence. What I especially like about it is, last spring, a number of speakers at commencements were jeered for talking about AI. This new program will begin by talking about the ethics of AI, the values associated with AI. We'll ultimately teach students how to use AI, and will produce products that'll indicate to us whether students are in fact competent. So the first competency they could earn here might be in AI.
I bet we're going to be able to get to everyone's questions, but let me read one more from the chat before I go to the hands up, folks. Corey Hollis from UCLA writes, I love the idea of an official career competency transcript. Is this something that comes from your registrar? Is it official in that sense? How do you verify extracurricular activities, non-affiliated internships or activities, or are they self-reported, asks Corey.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. That second transcript is largely being managed or developed by the Center for the Applied Liberal Arts that Arthur mentioned already, working in close collaboration with our registrar. And we are using a software platform. I saw one of these things come in the chat, question come in the chat that referred to a third party, where we're using a platform called
Suitable.
Suitable. Yes, thank you for reminding me. There's so many of these coming floating in my head.
Wait until you're my age.
And they're helping us. It's an app that will sit on every student's phone that will allow them to track their progress through the achievement of these micro credentials. Eventually, I think it's going to be used to be able to attest to and track some of these other experiential opportunities that will contribute towards the micro credentials. But honestly, we haven't worked all of those details out. We're still trying to figure out how best to integrate the non-coursework components of any particular micro-credential into them so that they are reliably attested to and so forth. But it's a partnership. It's certainly a partnership amongst a number of different units, not to mention our advising staff, who are going to be very important in their in the ways that they help guide our students.
What's exciting, I think, is that in contrast to the first transcript, which lists the courses students took and the grades that they've earned, this one will include the competencies they've achieved, and it'll also include the experiences that they've had. The importance of those two things can't be overstated. When you ask employers what's most important in hiring students, the answer surprised me. I thought it might be the school they went to. The answer was what experiences they've had. So our transcript will tell both.
And ultimately, that second transcript will officially come from the registrar.
Yes.
It will be Suitable as the kind of the collecting platform, but once all of that data is collected, it appears on a registrar certified transcript.
Thanks for addressing Kim Warren's question. She's from the University of Kansas. Appreciate that. Let's go to Robin from the University of Miami.
Hi, Robin.
Hi,
know
Jeff.
Robin.
How are you? Good to see you. And as a proud Brandeis alum, it's exciting to hear all this innovation happening.
Robin and I were colleagues at the University of Miami.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Great to see you. Great to see you. So we did something very similar called Cane Commitment, which was precisely the idea of being able to capture the core competencies that students achieve both through the curriculum and through co-curricular activities. So I'm curious about how you rolled it out and whether it's something that every student does or it's an opt-in, because we did a rollout with one school initially. Now we're expanding that, but one of the challenges that and we're using Suitable, and there's micro-credentialing and badging and all of that. But one of the challenges that we've had is really kind of getting all students and all faculty to kind of buy in. And so I'm wondering how you handled that.
Yeah. So I'll just make one distinction here, which I probably wasn't very clear about. The micro-credentials are optional. Students are not required to earn any of the micro-credentials. What's required is the Brandeis core. So for example, if you take something like the teamwork and collaboration competency, the core competency, students are required to take two courses in that are designated as teamwork and collaboration courses as part of their core curriculum to graduate. Actually, I think it's one course. I'm sorry, I'm remembering. It's one course. If they want to earn the micro-credential, then they have to take either the second course or participate in, they could be the captain of their sports team, and that would also probably count towards a teamwork and collaboration micro-credential. So the core is required of every student. The micro-credentials are entirely optional for students to undertake. And it's only the first the entering class this year is the first class that is under the new core curriculum. Our current students or returning students are still under the older core curriculum, but they do have the option of earning micro-credentials even with the old core curriculum. In terms of across schools, we don't have the 4 schools that Arthur mentioned are not as distinct as they are, say, at UM, where you have really very, very different schools with completely different requirements and so on. Every undergraduate at Brandeis University, irrespective of what they major in, has the same core curriculum, is the same under the same requirements. So that wasn't really a particular issue for us. We're much smaller anyway.
Let me give a concrete example. Let's pretend I'm a philosophy major, and I've decided when I'm done here, what I'm going to do is go to philosophy graduate school. I have to take the core. I have to study in the 4 new schools. I do not have to take the career advising. I do not have to take a practical experience. I do not have to have a second transcript. Okay, another philosophy student. In my sophomore year, I realized I can't open a philosophy store when I graduate. And I've got to earn a living. And decide, do you know something? Maybe I'll be a journalist. We can provide the hard skills through the core, and we can provide the career skills that can be put onto a transcript that'll be appropriate for journalism. And you can have experiences working in that field.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Robin. Before going to Kurt, let me read another from the chat. Emily Isaacs from Montclair State, who also is a Brandeis parent, was impressed by the faculty engagement experience that you've had and asked a question about, well, could you say a little bit more about that? What was motivating the faculty to be so involved and ultimately supportive of many deep reforms, obviously? And I'm paraphrasing a longer question. Sorry.
I apologize. Let me give Jeffrey a compliment. Jeffrey was marvelous in bringing the faculty together. We worked with small groups across the college, heterogeneous groups, and that's what made all of that possible. But there's one other thing, and it's timing. Brandeis had a gazillion task forces looking at its future. And I brought that the day we proposed the new direction to the faculty meeting, pack of reports. And I said, 95 of you were involved in these committees. Some of you were involved in a lot of these committees. And none of the recommendations were ever adopted. I had met with 160 faculty members in my first 2 months at Brandeis. And one of the things they told me was, we're tired of talking. We're ready to act. We want to act. And Jeffrey took that willingness, took an idea, and turned it into a new program.
I appreciate the compliment. It was very much a team effort. We really did. I've been at Brandeis. I'm just about to start my 4th year. And I have prioritized from the moment I got here, open lines of communication, sharing updates with my colleagues as quickly as I can about things that are developing, and embracing feedback. So the process that Arthur described when we presented the plan, the initial reorganization plan, was very much an iterative process, and that we got very important feedback from faculty along the way, from staff along the way, that we tried to integrate as much as possible. And even where we couldn't, I think the very active listening in a kind of meaningful and intentional way helped to buy us a lot of goodwill on that. The revision of the core was a bit more fraught, but I think it was still the case that because we tried to be as collaborative as we possibly could with faculty, while still understanding that we had a particular timeline that we wanted to follow, we were able to get it. We were able to get it through.
Hey, Kurt, great to see you. How about a question from WashU?
Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you so much, Arthur and Jeff. I concur that this is a fantastic reinvestment in the liberal arts and such a great holding up of UERU principles, so kudos. I am thinking, however, about Boyer 2030 and longstanding challenges about extracurriculars and co-curriculars being hard to access for so many reasons. So I'm wondering, with this refresh and with these new second transcripts and holding up of the importance, how have you thought about equity? How are you making sure that students get to where they need to go?
What do you mean by equity in this sense? In terms of getting where you need to go?
Sure. So I can speak most directly to my experience in engineering education. So much of the value add comes from research in laboratories, engagement in Engineers Without Borders and other community groups. And so much of that is an additional responsibility for students. And so for some reason, due to socioeconomic concerns, but also some reasons in terms of, is there capacity and is there familial backing to be engaged in those literally outside of the classroom activities? It's viewed as less than. So again, kudos for you for the second transcript, for the formalization of the importance, but there's equity concerns. So again, through the Boyer 2030 lens, how have you thought about those concerns?
2 quick comments, which may actually be 3 quick comments. It may actually not be that quick. But what I would say is that part of it's Brandeis' origin. Brandeis was created after World War II, and people associated largely with Judaism. And Brandeis is a non-sectarian Jewish university. However, the focus was on equity. The goal was to enroll not only Jewish students, but all those who were being denied access to higher education, women, people of color, international students would only be taken if they could pay their own way, and so on. So the equity's been a centerpiece of who we are. In terms of activities, we're also the smallest of the major research universities. And we're the smallest of the AAU institutions. So that I was going across campus last summer and I ran into a student and I said, "So what are you doing on campus this summer?" And he said, "Oh, I'm working in a lab." And I said, "Oh, whose lab?" This kid was a rising sophomore. So when he got hooked up with the lab, he was a freshman. The student named a Nobel Prize winner. And he didn't realize it was odd that a freshman would be in a Nobel Prize winner's lab. He thought that was the common rule of order at universities. And the third thing that I'd say about this is we're also working really, really hard in terms of corporate partnerships and in terms of expanding our array of activities that's available to students. We want them not to be able to take one experience, but to be able to take a whole variety of experiences. And so that becomes very, very important to us.
Yeah, I'll just add to that final point that one of the areas that I work very closely with our development office on is raising funds specifically targeting not just regular student scholarships, but also funds that make it possible for students who would otherwise have to choose working at a Starbucks in order to pay for their college education to be able to forego a paid job that may be as useful for them in terms of their life experience, to be able to take an unpaid internship or an unpaid research assistantship that would give them a much greater educational opportunity, and would be offset by some stipends that we could offer through there. So that's an ongoing effort. The other part of the access question that you raised, which is in my mind much more interesting and more challenging, is how do you address some of the kind of cultural, the different kinds of cultural expectations across different communities when it comes to, you know, families that think, well, if I'm paying this much money for my child to be at college, that's what they should be doing. They should be going to class and they should be working on their homework and nothing else. And I think that's a communications challenge. That's a challenge around helping the families to understand that there is as much benefit that students gain from these co-curricular opportunities as they might get from their biology class. And it's an ongoing it's an ongoing issue, but I think, again, communication for me is a really key component of that.
Superb, thank you.
Thank everyone for these great questions. Our colleague, Michael Bradford at the University of California, Davis.
Michael Bradford, too. I was a colleague of Michael Bradford's at UConn.
You know everyone, Jeffrey.
You have so many more friends than I do.
Well, Michael, of course, and I'm now reminded he was at UConn, asked two questions. One about post-tenure review process, any changes there, and how did you integrate the advising community in this restructuring?
Do we get a choice of which one we answer? You want that one?
Yeah. So post-tenure review is an interesting question, and I don't have a real answer for that. We have been talking about how to think about post-tenure reviews. Faculty fill out what we call a faculty activity report every year, which is meant to enter into any merit assessments and things like that. And we are trying to ensure that faculty support of these things outside of the classroom are credited, are valued as part of the ways in which they're reviewed. But there's nothing that's been implemented in any kind of systematic or comprehensive way. So it's a good question, Michael, but I'm not going to give you a very good answer. The second question around advising is, so the Academic Services Office reports to my office, and I work very, very closely with the director of that office, Lori Tenzer. And as we have been developing these changes to the core, and as we have been developing these micro-credentials, it's been with regular and constant interactions with Lori and her team to make sure that they understand what these changes mean, to make sure that they understand how to be able to direct students into these new opportunities and new possibilities. One of the things that I'm really hoping we can take better advantage of. I mentioned AI before, and I'm as suspicious of it as a lot of you are. But it seems to me that one possibility out there that I know other places are already taking fuller advantage of is that so too often the conversations that happen between students and their advisors are transactional, and they're about checking boxes. What do I need to do to finish my requirements? What do I need to do to get out of here? What do I need to do to graduate? A lot of those kinds of issues, I think, ought to be able to be addressed through a well-resourced AI bot or AI agent. What I want to do is take advantage of that technology so that we can leverage it in a way that frees up the time that our academic advisors have with each student to be able to have actual conversations with them and not just simply address the questions of what do I need to do to graduate, but what am I thinking about as I'm going through this process? How am I going to navigate the 4 years thinking about holistically about my experience here? What are my dreams? What are my aspirations? Our advising staff are eager to have those conversations. The problem is they just don't have the time to do it. And if we can create the space for those kinds of conversations to happen, I think everyone can benefit from that.
You've also done something else. He's done the unthinkable and the unspeakable, which is to say, Jeffrey's brought together the career counselors and the academic counselors and is trying to create partnerships between the two of them. It's something we desperately need and something that's terribly important to students.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure every institution has its slightly different structure of advising, but basically the way that academic advising works at Brandeis is first and second year students are typically managed, largely advised by our professional advising staff. And then once they identify a major, they're handed off to the undergraduate advising head in the particular program or department. They may continue to meet with the professional advisor for certain things, but the undergraduate advising head often becomes their primary advisor because they're the ones who can guide them through that path. And what we were finding is that the handoff wasn't always as successful as it needed to be, and that there were sometimes confusions and inconsistencies. And some of that was just simply about the fact that these two communities of advisors didn't regularly work with each other. And so we started by just having a half-day retreat that brought those two populations together to get to know each other, to kind of talk about the challenges that they face and what they see as the particular issues that in that interstice between professional advising and academic advising. But it has actually blossomed, and now we actually have a monthly reading group, or it meets once or every 2 months, where we pick a book on sort of recent developments in higher education, and we just get together and talk about it over a brown bag lunch. In fact, we have one today, this afternoon. We're talking about a book called The Pedagogy of Kindness by My goodness, I'm forgetting her name. She has a wonderful name. It's
Make it up.
anyway. It's just a great way to kind of continue to nurture those relationships and those connections between different populations of folks who are working with the students, but may not always talk with each other about it.
Thank you for proactively addressing Caton Carter's question. He's from UC Davis as well. We have a question from Matthew Rust and Barbara Blake Matthews at IU Indianapolis, Barbara at Old Dominion University. Pretty similar, kind of going into that, how you related to industry partners in crafting that second transcript, and what sort of interest have they shown in that, and how involved are they, if at all, in the formulation of those plans?
We've done a bunch of things there. I don't have all details, but what I'll tell you is we've used a lot of the research by Burning Glass. Thank you.
That's
How can our last name be Denial?
That's what I was trying to remember. She has that really great name, and it just seems so counterintuitive to what the book is about. But anyway,
we've used a lot of the research by groups like Burning Glass to see what the marketplace is looking for. In addition, we've assembled panels to work with us on different kinds of competencies, different kinds of needs in different industries. And that's something we hope to expand upon in the time that follows.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this center, the Center for Applied Liberal Arts, is building out an infrastructure to develop more robust relations with our corporate partnerships as much as possible. It's also true in our institutional advancement office, and I think it's really about just building some of that infrastructure more thoroughly and more intentionally with these kinds of connections in mind. It's a relationship that actually can work in both directions, because it can benefit our students, but it also can benefit the partners who may have employees that they want to send for supplementary education. That especially in our sciences, we have, as Arthur mentioned, Nobel scientists who are teaching in our biology department. There's a very robust biotech industry out here in the Boston area and in the Waltham corridor. Those partnerships make a lot of sense. We just need to make better use of them.
Can I answer a question nobody asked?
Yes, please.
And that question is, what are you worried about? What are the greatest dangers? Well, one, I find the fact that you asked me that question terrible. But the biggest danger we really face is that we're just putting this all together. We're trying it for the first time this fall, aside from a few pilots. We'll undoubtedly find that some things we thought would be wonderful aren't. We'll find that some things need to be changed. We're going to do this step by step. We're going to build. So we talk about micro-credentials. The number of micro-credentials will grow over the years. So it means we have a limited number now. When we talk about internships, we have a lot of internships. We need more. When we talk about every element of this program, we're trying a lot of different assessments. It would be wonderful. Our students take a lot of tests. What we're looking at now are what are other forms of assessment? Can we create game-based assessments? Can we create other mechanisms that'll be less taxing on students and still indicate to us what they're capable of doing? So the scariest things are the things we don't know and the things we're going to find out. But we recognize these changes will take time to mature, and they'll require continuous iterations to reach where we need to go.
Good. I maybe insert a final question then. Just it occurs to me that we have a great opportunity to hear from you, President Levine. The question being, what would you advise folks like Jeffrey who are working at public and private universities around the country and world as they face the issues we all know we face? Do you have any thoughts for them about what they might do in particular, other than read the book, of course, which is critical, but any advice for us?
I'd have my curriculum vitae typed and be ready to, no. The reality is, this is an extraordinary moment in higher education history. Our generation is being given a chance to reshape the nature of undergraduate education. The last time a generation had that opportunity was 150 years ago. So this is incredibly daunting. One of the things I've always told presidents, and it applies to Jeffrey and everybody else, what I tell them is scare the hell out of your faculty, tell them the truth, and then invite them to join you in planning the future of your institution. It's a time to bring institutions together, not divide institutions. It's a time to create things that were never created before. This is a moment in which if you can dream it, you can probably do it.
That reminds me of a quip attributed to Harry Truman where someone said, "Give them hell, Harry." And he said, "I'll give them the truth and they'll think it's hell."
I like that very
Thank
much.
you, Arthur, and thank you, Jeffrey, for taking time to share about the book, the new book from Johns Hopkins University Press, From Upheaval to Action, What Works in Changing Higher Ed. And thank you for sharing about what the exciting things you're doing at Brandeis University, which I'm sure we all can learn from, whether we're a smaller private or a larger public university, and whether we're in the US or elsewhere. We so appreciate on behalf of all the URU community. Thanks to you both. And thanks to all of you for having joined this town hall and posed such wonderful questions to our guests. We'll wrap it up for now and wish you the best for your rest of your day and week. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for inviting us.
Our pleasure.
Have a great day, folks. Jeffrey, we'll talk soon.
Yes, Michael, I owe you a call.